Welcome back to the Merchant Mariner podcast. I have with me Captain Don Sanders, a retired steamboatman whose decades involved with this river have composed a book and quite a career that we'll cover here on the show. But starting with him as a foremost expert per se in all things steamboat, I welcome Captain Don Sanders to the show.
Thank you, Tim. It's great being back.
Well, sir, we ran a few questions by you earlier. The point of this episode will be to chronicle the history and development of the steamboat as it pertains to the American economy, to the towboat and barge industry, and of course to the passenger industry. I know, admittedly, very little. I've met with David Greer about it and got basics of history and from his perspective and insights, but I'd like to follow up with you for the very same thing. So please, um, I guess start wherever you think we need to, but I'm looking to, the steam engine is built, I think, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. When is it adopted here on vessels? And I guess how did everything develop over the years?
Well, it did start in the mid to late 1700s up on the East Coast. Everything started on the East Coast with the development of the steamboats, mostly on the eastern seaboard and on the rivers of the East. And then when migration started over the Appalachian Mountains and people came across this great broad expanse of land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. The area was so vast, and there was a ready, available system of waterways that the development of vessels was obvious. Of course, everything at that time, not everything, but most everything was still sail powered, and sails were not adapted very well to use on the river system with the hills and the curves and the currents of the Mississippi and tributary rivers. Another form of locomotion had to be developed to get the vessels up and down the rivers. At that time, they did have flatboats, keel boats. Of course, the Native Americans had developed a very intricate system, a very detailed system of travel by various types of their vessels, mainly the canoe. But with the development of the steam engine on the East Coast, it was only obvious that it had to be brought over to the river system. And they called it, and we still call it the Western Rivers. Now, people think of the Western Rivers today as probably the Sacramento or San Joaquin or some river in California, but actually, in definition, Western Rivers is the Mississippi and Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, and those rivers of the Mississippi River system. Um, so it was obvious, that something had to be done. So what they did was bring the very first early type of and experimentation. This was done mainly by the Fulton and his partner Livingston, and their boats that they had the Claremont. They had developed the Claremont on the East Coast, so they started working on a boat for the Mississippi system, and that was the New Orleans, the steamer New Orleans side wheeler in 1811, 1812. And those boats were run by a low pressure vertical, the cylinder was vertical, low pressure type of engine. And the boat was built in Pittsburgh or thereabouts, and was taken down the river in 1811 and was able to actually go upstream against the current. I know they stopped in Cincinnati, they stopped in Louisville. Of course, that was also the year of the great earthquake in the comet of 1811, and that was when the Mississippi River actually reversed its flow and flowed upstream for a period of time. But with the disruption of the river, uh, the, the New Orleans for a time stayed in Louisville and ran trips, mostly excursion type trips between Cincinnati and Louisville, eventually reaching Louisville in January 1812. Uh, Thereafter, with the type of construction and the constructions of the early vessels, well, that was the earliest vessel, and then for a few years later, was based on the shipbuilding type of hull, uh, with the deep hull, heavy timbers, actually even the bowsprit out in front of the vessel, uh, and sails and masts. I think the New Orleans did have a sail and a square mast, and that might have been used, limited use. Well, the New Orleans was not really uh, uh, very adaptable to water, uh, other than deep water, so it ran for the rest of its career, which lasted, I think, about to 1815 when it burned. It ran from New Orleans to Natchez and back, and then that's then after a while, the builders began to realize that they had to adapt vessels to their environment and not to the environment of the East Coast, and they had to start making improvements in the hull and the machinery, and in the hull they realized that weight was a great factor, so that the hulls had to be lightened, and they did that by broadening the hulls. A lot of the early ship appurtenances of the hull were removed or replaced. The bowsprit was actually raised, and in a sense, it's still used today. It became the jack staff, and out on even on the head of a tow of barges, you got the center light, which shows white light ahead, so many points past the beam, and then also the blue light that shows back to the pilot. Now, this wasn't the jack staff wasn't just to put up a flag. Jack staff or uh, Union Jack or whatever, any type of flag, though they did fly, it was mainly to give the pilot guidance. That's what they still do today. They still guide this so the pilot knows where the head of the tow is, and he can also use that, and use the light with various methods that pilots have developed over the years to keep the tow off the head of the tow off the bank, and different steering techniques. Uh, the bows, I mean, the hulls started lightening up. They came broader. They realized that they didn't need the deep rounded shape because they didn't have the wind. We didn't need as much freeboard because we didn't have as high waves on the inland waters. And so slowly and surely, uh, the hulls redeveloped from the ship type things to more of a boxy type, but they did need a rounded bow, either a bottle bow or a scow bow, or for the end, and also the later on the hull was rounded too, especially when they started bringing steam stern wheelers in. And then besides the uh, changes to the hull and the weight and the shape and design, the engines had to be redeveloped. The the vertical engine proved unsatisfactory, and especially because the boats had to make bank landings. There weren't wharf system set up, nor were wharves practical on the rivers because of the constant raising and lowering of the level of the water. Um, the low vertical, I mean, the vertical low pressure engines usually had a high beam, walking beam they called it, with back and forth up top. So they had to redevelop the engine, and they and a fellow named Evans was one that found out that or developed what he called the high pressure engine, and actually it was much higher, and then the pressure got up to in the hundreds of 100 pounds, 120 pounds, 130 pounds those days, which was quite a bit. And then later, the engine was uh, brought into a horizontal or nearly horizontal position, which greatly improved the efficiency of the engines. And, and after a while, I think it was about by 1830, high pressure steam engines were pretty much developed in the shape that they were going to take for the remainder of the history of steam engines on the river. With some exceptions, with some valve arrangements, or somebody had a modification or had their own thing. But basically, it was a cylinder with a piston that connected with a crosshead to a pitman arm to a crank that turned the shaft of a paddle wheel, either a side wheeler or a stern wheeler. At first, practically and virtually all the boats were side wheelers. And at first, they had one engine that turned the center shaft, and it turned both wheels, so it could only go in without. Some had arrangements to try to stop one side and come ahead on the other. But it wasn't until two engines were placed aboard a steamboat, one on each side wheel, that they became much more efficient and effective. And uh, the engines were very wasteful. They were wasteful in fuel. They were heavy. They were clumsy. They weren't made with the greatest precision. But in spite of all that, they worked particularly well in their environment and what they really needed to have them do on the river. And being high pressure engines, they were able to develop uh, speed that until the introduction of the railroad, until the introduction of the train, was pretty much unheard of. A good steamboat might go 12, 15 miles an hour uh, and faster, depending on the current, whatever. So the evolution of the steamboat changed, and it was until about 1848. First, they were boxy and clumsy and a little bit ugly and whatever. So with modifications, and they became more adapted. And then one of the fellows that one of the men that probably could get much or very much of the credit was Henry Miller Shreve, steamboat man, born in Pennsylvania. I think he grew up in a little bit of Kentucky, and he was a part of the steamboat people out of Pittsburgh, and eventually he made great changes not only to the steamboat and also to the changes in the nature of the river when he developed his snag boat, the Heliopolis, and was able to remove the great Red River raft uh, and his camp his workmen camped out at on the Red River became Shreveport, Louisiana. But it was these changes with the structure, with the mechanics, and with the uh, structure later of the nature of the river itself through locks and dams and removal of obstacles, snag boats, developed over the years, mainly before the Civil War, and pretty much remained the same without slight modifications until the end of the steamboat era.
Well, if I may, before we continue with this history, you did mention the moving parts of the steam engine, but fill me in to whatever detail you're able. How energy was converted from, I assume, a burner all the way to that turning wheel.
Steam was introduced through a valve system I'm not a steamboat engineer, though I do have some time in the engine room. And I, as a young fellow, 17 years old, I was handling. That's what they call it, handling, because the boats were engine room controlled. By the pilot house would ring down for whatever what we called the bell. It might be, from full ahead to full astern to stop and whatever. Uh, so steam was introduced through a throttle in the steam was generating the boilers, and the boiler, and that's a whole uh, realm itself to talk about the boilers that they first, where they first started, and later became a system of several boilers side by side, an invention of the steam drum, the mud drum underneath to help get mud out of the boilers, which is a big factor in the cost of a lot of trouble and even accidents and injuries and deaths on the river. The amount of sediment that was in the boilers and all had to be tended to. But anyway, it's a good clean boiler. Let's say and steam goes through the main line back to the engine room where there's a big round wheel that the engineer or his assistant or a striker in my case was able to turn or shut off to introduce a certain amount of steam through main steam line and into the cylinder of the engine. Let's say they had two engines, and both of these engines were high pressure engines. Though later on, low pressure cylinders were introduced. The Delta Queen has a high pressure cylinder on one side and a low pressure cylinder on the other. So the steam would go into the cylinder, and so much would be allowed, and it would shove or push a piston head to toward the opposite end of the piston, and with the use of the valve system, just so much steam would be allowed into that valve, into that cylinder rather, and it would, and through the expansion of the steam, it would travel that way, and then at that end, maybe then the steam would another blast of steam would push it the other way, so we'd get this back, horizontal back and forth motion of the travel of the piston head. I know it's a lot more complex than that, but that's basically it. And also allowing a vacuum would come into it, and the cooling of the steam. There would be so many things, but basically it was a cylinder of steam going in and out, pushing the cylinder head, and that attached to the cylinder head was a steel rod that came out to the back of the engine, and that's called the piston. And the piston was connected to it didn't go all the way back to the engine. It would have a travel or distance in that, and yeah, a lot of the early engines, the piston would travel about 3, 4, 5 feet. Some of the bigger vessels they travel 10, 11, maybe. I think the J.M. White piston had it had a distance of travel about 12 feet. But then it would be I was a side wheeler, and I'm thinking more in terms of stern wheelers because that's what I grew up on. But then it would connect and it was the same for side wheelers. And then it would connect through what was called crosshead. There was a joint that would, from the rigid piston to give motion, so they could give motion to a circular motion. It would connect in the crosshead to a long beam called crosshead to a pitman arm, and that pitman arm had the flexibility at the crosshead, and it would connect to a crank, just a round crank, and that would convert horizontal motion into circular motion, and that would turn the paddle wheel. I know, and a high pressure boat, which most all the boats were, as I said at that time, would usually be non-condensing, and that meant that the exhaust steam would shoot out either sometimes it was used like it was on the steamer Avalon, which is now the Belle of Louisville, to help exhaust. It was directed up the smokestacks, or what we call chimneys. You go up the chimney to help the draft of the boilers, or it would go what you see often depicted on old steamboats, a set of pipes or a set of stacks right over the engine room, and those were called escape pipes, or we just call them escape pipes, and it would blast out the exhaust. But much louder than that, you could hear the boats coming sometimes for miles, and people would recognize a lot of times what boat was coming by the sound of the steam escaping off the roof. Um, and some boats were condensing, like the Delta Queen. It's cross compound condensing engines, and what would happen to the exhaust on the Delta Queen was it was condensed through with condensers, and the precipitate or the water would collect in a big uh, uh, open steel container with layers of loofah sponges, called the hot well, and the water would drip in there. The hot condensed steam that would contain grease and oil from the lubrication of the cylinder of the engine, and loofah sponges would be used to filter grease and whatever else out, pretty much. And that was very clean water, usually as compared to the river water, and it would be reintroduced to the it'd be reintroduced into the boilers, and it was much cleaner, and we didn't have to shut down the boilers to clean the boilers, which, like on the fellow low, is hot as high pressure non-condensing, and about once a week the boat had to be shut down, and boilers had to be cleaned, and the boilers themselves would be open, and use some fire hoses and hammers and chisels, chippers, and we would chip the scale and blow anything out of there we could. It was quite a process, and we'd be shut down for a day. But that's, to my pretty much amateur, I guess amateur or rookie knowledge of the engine room. That's real basic how I interpret the engines being worked to propel the steamboat.
Yes, sir, and thank you for that. The run to Cincinnati that you discussed first, was that primarily cargo movements? What was the business of the steamboat? Well, I think there were a fair amount of passengers usually on each trip as well.
And what period of time do you mean?
From the beginning, I suppose, the early
Oh yeah,
1800s.
yeah. Of course, cargo that was such a big thing in those days. Cargo, uh, because uh, the West, things weren't, they didn't have all that yet, and it was just a huge amount of time. It's hard, today it's still that it's huge amount, but every place has, and the things changed so much. But it was such a vast territory. And I read one time that if a person traveling by at that time, not on steamboat, but by other means, by horse or by foot, or going from here to St. Louis or wherever it would take your. I'm in the Cincinnati area, though. It would take probably weeks, and then there was a lot of times it would take longer, and there's a good chance you wouldn't even make it. You might be hurt, a broken leg, out on the trail in those days, out on the what they didn't have roads. They probably pretty much were following Indian trails. They weren't paved. And if you had a broken leg out there in the middle of nowhere, good chance you might not make it, you might die. But anyway, as people expanded out and started going into other areas, let's say not further than St. Louis or just beyond at this time, and all the places in between cities, places became settlements for Louisville and all the little places in between. They needed goods, and the goods they needed a lot of them, and a lot of these goods came over from at first from the East Coast, and as things came in first, let's say to Pittsburgh, uh, then factories and different types of businesses were developed there. And as it spread out, then the businesses and industry and building and then boat building and shipbuilding and everything else that became civilization start developing in other places. Cincinnati became uh, uh, great for its iron and steel in Pittsburgh. Pardon me. Cincinnati became the meatpacking center of the country before this part of the country before Chicago. Excuse me. And then Louisville became big because of its place on the Ohio, at the falls of the Ohio, and on and on and on. But moving cargo was very, very big. Moving people was also a part of it, but it probably wasn't. That's not really where the great amounts of revenue was generated for the owners of the steamboat. So, and a lot of the though a lot of people were moved. So I'd say mostly it was a movement of freight and cargo up and down the rivers that really stimulated the need for it. That influenced the expansion of the steam navigation on the Western rivers.
Well, what was a fully crewed boat? How many individuals on deck or on board, and what were they doing? Plus, how many passengers usually would there be?
Well, you'd have the Marine crew. You'd have what I call the Marine crew. You'd have the captain and a mate. The captain's usually not like towboat today. Towboat today, a captain stands a navigation watch. Back in the old steamboat days, a captain or a master of the boat, he was, as I was actually trained to be, a roof captain. I always kind of equated the captain, that type of captain, a roof captain, as mayor of the city, like you're the mayor, but working type of mayor. And then we'd have two pilots, one on each watch. You'd have a mate, a head mate. You'd probably have the second mate and secondary mates, and then you'd have a, a deck crew of deck hands that were trained in the handling of the lines, and they probably did some cargo handling, especially back in the old days. And a lot of those boats also, and they also had probably carried some rousters and roustabouts or lavers who weren't part of the paid crew so much as but they would go with the boat, and they were paid for the actual work they would do, loading and unloading freight, and also fuel, which in those days was a wood. They could have wood before wood yards. They had to cut their own wood, and after a while, it became a business in its own, operating a wood yard where the boat could come in. And if you had passengers, you had basically two types of passengers. You'd have deck passengers, which were immigrants or poor people or people who couldn't afford the cabins, and they're cabin passengers. And these were usually people that more affluent type of passenger could afford a room and the meals, and the meals were included with their fare. And with the deck passengers, the meals probably weren't. People had to bring their own food quite often. And with the rousters and if they were included, they usually slept as did all the deck passengers. They slept what they call if it's cold, they slept under the boilers. And there's old Steamboat song, and it had a refrain. It says, I won't try to sing it, but it said, "Where was you last night? Or where was you last night?" And the refrain was, it was under them boilers of sleeping. So people would sleep under the boilers, and that was also when a lot of times they would carry livestock, and especially pigs, hogs, and it was also that area was also called hog heaven. And sometimes Rouster, old steamboat man, said he was at hog heaven last night. He probably curled up with a hog. And that quite often that's what they said. Anybody to keep warm, on the boat, because they didn't provide a whole lot unless you paid that deck, unless you paid that cabin fare, and then you more meals were included with expenses of traveling. You had, and if you had those type of people, which meaning uh, paying passengers, then you had a staff, the kitchen staff, and you had waiters, you had maids and chambermaids. You had, of course, the engine crew. You had a chief engineer, and probably uh, one or two, depending on the size of the vessel. Assistant engineers. This is more in the later times. And you had helpers or apprentice engineers, which I was a little bit, called striker engineers. Um, and you had your boiler crew, you had firemen. I worked with some of my dearest friends on the river ever were Ed Smith and Bubba Chin. They were two firemen from who had been on steamboats all their life. Ed Smith, which I mentioned last time, talked to you. He was from St. Louis, came from the Streckfus line, and he was born down in Arkansas, just west of Memphis, Tennessee. And I'm working and trying to get some help and try to get Ed Smith in the National Rivers Hall of Fame for he definitely deserves it for many reasons. Bubba Chin was in the band on the Avalon called the Rhythm Masters. And during the breaks of the band, he played saxophone. And during the breaks of the band, he'd come down the boiler room, and he was friends of Ed Smith and Fred of another fireman on the boat. And he learned to fire the boat. And when the one fireman left, not Ed, Bubba went to Capt Wagner and asked if he could become the fireman. And Capt Wagner told me how that was the only time a fireman was ever come out of the bandstand, or it's usually the other way around. The fireman would try to find another job. It was a tough job. Even though what I remember is all oil fired, but in the early days it was the firing was done with about 4 foot long pieces of lumber, timber, and then later on it was done with coal. And one of my favorite firemen was old gentleman that I just loved, named Robert Lawler. Robert Lawler, of course, all the men were black men, uh, African American uh, members of the crew. But Robert Lawler was called Preacher, and Preacher started Steamboat in I think about the 1880s, late 1880s, 1890, and he started on the boat as cabin boy, I believe, and he couldn't read or write, but he learned to sign his name. I said one time I wrote about it, he learned to sign his name with a flourish. Uh, he worked for Captain Ryman out of Nashville, Tennessee, on his boats, and Captain Ryman, who later got religion, Ryman did, and he built the Ryman Auditorium. It was called the Union Gospel Tabernacle at first, and then later became the Ryman Auditorium, a country music hall of fame, country music fame. But Robert worked for Captain Ryman, and Ryman taught Preacher, though Preacher couldn't read, the scriptures at length. So on Sundays, Captain Ryman would tie his boats up, and the white people would go uptown to a white church, and the African American people would go probably church of their own racial racial choosing, and everything was segregated, of course, in those days. But as the boat was out there in the weeds somewhere and not close to any kind of churches, the white passengers and all went to church services up on the cabin deck or up on the boiler deck, and Robert would gather the African American people who wanted to have a church service out on the bow, and being he knew these uh, knew the scriptures at length, he would minister to them or preach to them, and he held that name till he died, and he lived say 93 years old. And I knew him when he was in first met him when he was late 18. I mean, late 80s, older than I am now, and he was always preaching. And I've got a story in the book about him that might be one you might look at. Is about he was quite an interesting gentleman. Uh, and life went on those boats. Well, you asked me how they were staffed, and I get off base here, but uh, that's so we covered all the departments. So that's pretty much how I remember. And basically, steamboats were staffed.
Well, I've heard over the years, especially on Facebook groups and things like that, the old guard, the folks like you, your generation of mariner, have said, boats were made of wood and men of steel, and uh, it brought to mind. I know, of course, you mentioned Captain Shreve and his snag boat, which we'll touch more on here shortly. But how frequent were incidents with these steamboats? How catastrophic were these things happening? Any stories on especially catastrophic losses?
On the boats.
Yes,
Oh,
sir.
sure, they had a lot of the technology of the the tech the technology of these vessels, especially the metallurgy and the boats at first for many years didn't even have a safety, not safety valve, but well, at first they didn't either, but then they were developed, but didn't have steam gauges on them, so pressure gauges. So they didn't know what the pressure was. The engineers went by the sound, what he figured by how much steam he was introducing, how it sounded going in the engines, and whatever. What he figured that the steam was probably at, and it probably worked pretty well. There everything was run, even from the construction to so much of the vessel was run by what called rule of thumb. If it worked, that's what they use. That's a common way of doing things. We all do have something we do by rule of thumb, and but there were well, we're talking about disaster. So anyway, the technology wasn't developed that way. So at times they, without an accurate way of determining what was in their boilers, or if the, and a lot of times it was due to the construction. This construction, a lot of the steamboats and the equipment was done at pretty hasty pace many times to get it done, and it wasn't done with the greatest precision. A lot of it because they didn't know any better, and they would have there were fires were a big problem on the all wooden boats made of very flimsy wooden boats fired by with a great roaring fire. I mean, just a tremendous fire contained within a enclosed space, steam and a tremendous pressure, 150 pounds, 180 pounds, 200 pounds even, and there might and snags and different things that were the danger to running the ground to the vessel. and say hitting a snag at some time would cause a shift in the water in the boilers, or even could cause a fracture from a big giant log could come up through the hole, come up into the boilers, happen, causing the boilers to break. And when they did, you'd have virtually a steam explosion and high pressure steam. Steam would all that condense, all that steam under pressure would suddenly condense and with great force, and it's literally blowing up the boat and causing a lot of deaths, injuries, scalding, all types of losses through that. The people, a lot of people remember those old boats more for that than they do for a lot of other reasons. And there was a lot of danger to it at times, and until over the years the government stepped in and they started causing to bring in safety features, different things. And then as technology got better and better, there were less and less of those. Like today with the Bella Louisville or the steamer Natchez in New Orleans, steamboats still carrying passengers. The Natchez probably right at this minute. People don't really think of that. You know, I never was afraid on a steamboat that was going to explode. That was never. I knew that steamboats had exploded and or burned, and a lot of times fire was a big aftermath of a steamboat explosion, and they didn't have the safety features that safety equipment that boats do to this day. Life jackets for one. They did have wooden floats at times, and anything that would float became uh, something for somebody to grab on. A lot of times, shutters. That was actually an approved life-saving device at one time on the old steamboat. Was the shutters on the window. There were stories of a boat going down, and some heroic person ran around, was taking all the shutters off the windows and throwing the shutters in the river for somebody to something to cling to, for people to have something to cling to. Um, but today, after many years, and with now that the United States Coast Guard gets annual inspections of these boats, and quarterly inspections, and they're all tough, they're all rigid, very rigid, and and the boats, every boat that I worked on always does its best to make sure that everything's up to snuff, and boats are safer.
Well, getting back to I guess, the chronology of the evolution of the towing industry, once Captain Shreve got out there and cleared the snags and opened up this river and opened up the Red River, um, were I don't, this might be a tough question to answer, but I guess what percentage of boats that left, say, Pittsburgh, destined for New Orleans, how frequent were these accidents? What percentage of vessels never made it to destination?
I couldn't give you any figure there, but I would say that most of them did. I you know, I the boats. The biggest thing about the boats is they didn't last long; they'd wear out fast. But some did, a lot did burn, and I'm sure that there are figures on those. But I've been trying to brush up a little lately on my. If you can see it here, can you see it? The Steamboats on the Western Rivers by Lewis C. Hunter. This is a whole education in itself. Over the years, I've been reading it, and lately, the last few days, I've been trying to hit it again to refresh my memory on some of these facts and figures. But I think you might, if I could dig in that and find that he probably has the answer. This is the probably the book on the economic and technological history of the steamboats on the Western Rivers. But I'd say the percentage wise, I don't know, 3%. I don't know. I probably wouldn't be too far off. I'd say the chance of a boat leaving Pittsburgh and getting down to New Orleans and back was pretty good. I don't, but some didn't make it, and for whatever reason, it wasn't just an explosion and blowing up. A lot of them had trouble with the Mississippi River. It's a lot different. It was a lot different in those days. We can't imagine a river that was just literally infested with giant logs and snags and sawyers and different type of things. It made the river almost impassable. But that was, but I'd say the vast majority of the boats did make it, but some didn't. And the ones that didn't make it are the ones that the stories, the dramas, it brings a drama to all this, and the stories are written about.
What size tows were these boats pushing?
Well, tows came along later. They pretty much after Civil War. I would at first the tows were not too big. There were different type of tows. I'm talking steamboat era. I'm not talking today when you go down, you know, 10,000 horsepower towboat with big steel hull and everything. Just and I'm not trying to make discount the problems that the modern towboat pilot has, because this guy's good towboat. Anybody that's run a towboat is a good person that would be there, and they have a lot of skills that are just unbelievable, and they're probably in their own in today's time just as valuable as the skills that people steamboatmen had back then. But in some ways, the original vessels, one of the two original vessels was a flatboat. Flatboat. I'm talking about when the West, when the people start moving up, people immigrants start coming to this country, and then they cross the Appalachian. That I'm not talking about Native American people, but flatboats were one of the first type of vessels used on the rivers, and they only went one way because they had no type of propulsion. The other was keel boats that were built more like a little boat model bow on each end, and they were and both were hand powered or river powered mainly on the way down, but sometimes a little bit of sail uh, uh, on keel boats. You might see pictures of them with the sails that try to maybe the wind was upriver in certain places they could use it, but mainly everything was hand done. But when it started, but actually the flatboats actually survived, pretty much have survived and were used during the steamboat era. And they were used actually up until the early 1900s. And they carried cargo that uh, usually a bulk cargo like coal or rock or whatever it might be, or low dollar priority type of freight, like say the freight of a farmer might build his own flatboat, and he couldn't afford to hire somebody to take his corn or his whiskey or whatever his cargo was, his produce down to market, say to New Orleans. But he could build his own little boat, and he'd get on it, and his brother and maybe a couple of his older sons, and they would drift on down the river. But actually, this type of vessel continued on, and later, in some respects, it became the barge, kind of the basis for the barge when the steamboat, as the as it got into the later part, post, we had an era of, especially on the lower Mississippi River after the Civil War, were the great packet boats, the J.M. White, oh gosh, can't think of all those names now, but Natchez, Robert E. Lee, gosh, you should know all this. Now, carried passengers and became famous, and those are the boats most people remember. But those happened in like the 1870s or after 1865 when the war ended. Uh, but also and that was also the time that railroads came in. So the railroads would start taking away from the the, the river uh, for the movement of passengers. That was the first to go. Why go uh, 3, 4, 5, 15 miles an hour when you go, say, 20, 25, 30 miles an hour, whatever those trains went, much faster. And so first was the passengers, they left. And then a lot of, say, high priority cargo that needed to go by, like fruit, vegetables, let's say, for example, might go by train then because they could do it much faster. But other cargoes that you didn't have to be so concerned with time, such as coal, uh, such as grain, large could be put into uh, vessels and we call barges, put into barges and taken to market and used. Then the towboats, their change in steamboats, the basic principle of the towboat with a steam engine and the crew in the hulls and the cabin and structures and all that pretty much remained the same as they were during the elegant days of the packet boat. But they lost their frillness, their fanciness. They didn't have so much of gingerbread and they didn't have a lot of things. They became work boats. But but the size of the tows weren't that large uh, as they probably as they are today. They grew, and it depended on with it. I'm sure some of the cold tows got to be quite large, and most of that type of towing evolved on the Ohio River, coming down to out of Pittsburgh, out of the cold country up there that way, and cold going all the way to New Orleans. There were certain restrictions. The locks at Louisville may have been a restriction on this type of thing. But then on the upper Mississippi, we had raft boats. And rafting at first was before the Civil War, was strictly by current and without the use of the raft boat or steam towboat that towed these rafts, of great rafts of virgin timber, like white pine from Wisconsin white pine, and they would great rafts would be formed, say, out of the Chippewa River up on the upper Mississippi River, and it'd be formed there right around the mouth of the Chippewa River, and floated down the river to places as far south as St. Louis, the sawmills. And at first they didn't have boats, and I can't imagine. And this is also true on tributary rivers like the Tennessee and the Cumberland and Kentucky, probably the Allegheny and the Monongahela, those type of rivers. They were floated down without towboats or raft boats, and later on the raft boat was developed, and it was a small towboat without fads, frills, fancies, and it also could be not just in tow like we imagine a towboat is generally, but also they could swing the stern out to so it's flat, not with a bow against the stern of the raft, but flat against the raft so we could shove or pull and twist and turn on the get around the bends of the river. And a lot of times they'd have to split the rafts in half, and half the raft coming to a bridge pier. And it's amazing what they could do. And half the raft would go through this way, and one the other half through the other side of the pier, and then blow, and then they would rejoin back together. And it was amazing what the ability that boat had.
How quickly, I think you said maybe 5 years or so after the Civil War, did the steamboat kind of fall out of favor for these cargo operations, and when did they develop into the sort of passenger industry that we know now?
Well, that came about as on some uh, towboat, on some steamboats, as the demand for packet boats, which is carried freight, uh, became less and less. And what really fueled that, and still to this day, the one thing that fuels the so-called passenger boat industry on the river is nostalgia. Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi, Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, Jim, all of that, to go back and revisit those days, nostalgia. And it was people, various people that owners of some certain lines who realized that their packet trade, hauling freight, hauling uh, passengers traveling from one place to the other, that was diminishing, and they experimented with and found out that hauling passengers for recreation or entertainment or cruising uh, what became profitable for them, and there were various people been on that did this, and but I would like to believe that on the Mississippi, on the Upper Mississippi, and the Lower Mississippi too, in New Orleans and St. Louis, we had the Streckfus family, Streckfus line, and then on the Ohio River, where I grew up, we had the Green family. That's Green with a final E. Captain Chris Green. We can see over here in the back of me. There's a picture of the Chris Green. That's one of the boats that Captain Christopher Green first uh, experimented with hauling passengers for uh, recreation and vacation type of trade, then hauling them just from Cincinnati up to Pittsburgh or down to somewhere else just to get them there. They can take the train and get there faster, but they can sit back and relax and enjoy it. All those things of the old time steamboat days. And Captain Tom, and then his son, Captain Tom Green, took over, and his brother, Captain Chris Green, and they ran that. Chris, they ran that boat until Captain Tom Green, the oldest son, bought the Delta Queen in 1947, and all that continued up pretty much until this year. The American Queen, and I don't know all the details of it. It quit running, and I like to eventually really realize what went on behind the scenes but uh, steam passenger excursions, overnight excursions, lasted from the first steamboat taking overnight people, the New Orleans in 1811, to the American Queen, which went out of business this beginning of this year, sometime in 2024. There are some boats still running, the Viking and different. I'm not real familiar with those boats. Really, they look like ships. So we've gone back to the ship design again on the river. Maybe with improvements on the river and everything, maybe these are actually better. Uh, the, we still have two steam excursion boats running on the Mississippi system. The steamer Natchez in New Orleans, and the steamer Bella, Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky. The Bells just laid up for the winter just recently, and the Natchez will be running. They were, down your neck of the woods, they'll be running all winter. And of course, the big time of the year for them would be Mardi Gras time. But we still have steam uh, passenger boats still running. The Bella Louisville is 110 years old this year, and but what keeps them going is nostalgia, the and the writings of Mark Twain. I think a lot of steamboats, they seem to have gotten different owners, especially I never worked on the American Queen, though I was invited to, but by that time I was ready to retire. But I would say if I was wanting to run a passenger boat, steam passenger boat, and I wanted to be successful, I would go back to the ways of Tom Green and Chris Green and that family, or the old Structures family, or follow and pump Mark Twain. A lot of Mark Twain, a lot of nostalgia. I see where the one of the mottos and one of the slogans of one of the boats, I think they might have used, might be one they use. It's mainly ads I see on TV, and they're on the river here, but they're also in Europe, and so about the best part about it is being there, not getting there. Well, on the old time steamboat, we always emphasize the getting there, the boat itself, the cruise, the steam, the calliope, all of that went with the old type of nostalgia. And that's what I would go with. And that's what I think people, instead of worrying about how many thread counts are on the sheets and how modern the room might be. And of course, a lot of people seem to like that. But I think for the longest time, the nostalgia, and I think it'd still be successful, was what would sell cruises on the river.
Well, that does get us to today. But in closing here, a few more questions on history. Uh, Tell me what you can about the lives of Captain Wagner and of Doc Hawley, where they came from, how they got into their careers, and how they built a name for themselves.
Doc and Roddy, I mean, Doc, not Roddy, but Captain Wagner and Captain Hawley. Captain Wagner was born and grew up in Johnson City, Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee. And during the Great Depression, there were no jobs there. And things were tough, just like most everywhere else in the country at that time. But he had a brother who went to Detroit, Michigan, and got a job in the automobile. No, he didn't go to Detroit, he went to Toledo. His brother went to Toledo, Ohio. This was back in the 1930s. Then he got a job in plant making automobile tires, and they were hiring that. And he said, send him a postcard, however they communicated, and says, Ernie, get up here and get up to Toledo. They're hiring now, and there'll be a job for you. Well, Ernie Wagner had no way else of getting up there than other than getting on a freight train, hoboing. So he jumped on the train that he figured it was heading that way. At least it was heading north, and probably a little bit to the west. And he rode the train. And he said he rode whatever it was, probably maybe a day or two or several days. Anyway, this train finally stopped. And he was in I guess, in a freight car. And he looked out, and there was a big river in front of him. He didn't know where he was. So he hopped out of the car and walked down to the river, and there was a wharf boat. And he walked across the wharf boat, and he said he actually walked across another boat that was tied up, and there was another boat tied to the outside of it. It was the Island Queen tied to the inside, and then he walked over to the, I guess it was the Island Maid, and he was there on the Island Maid, and he said, are you doing any hiring? And he said, well, what he asked if he had any experience. He said, no, I don't know anything. But they looked at him. He stood about 6'4", 6'5", weighed about 250 pounds, big, strong young man. And they said, so they hired him right away. And I think he was hired in the storage department, and just like I was, and he didn't want to stay in the storage department. He wanted to get in the where they did something besides serve food and beverages, that type of thing. So he ended up, and they made him a watchman on the dance floor. So you'd have troublemakers come on the boat. Of course, they'd have drinking and liquor on the boat, and you'd always needed like they were like a patrolman or like a onboard policeman. But Wagner is 6'4", 6'5", and his size didn't need to really do more than come on the scene, and whatever disturbance was going on, the participants would look over this big giant and was deciding it was time to behave themselves. So he became a watchman on those boats, the Island Queen and the Island Maid, and he really enjoyed it. And all thoughts of going to Toledo to work in the tire plant were long gone, because he found a place that he seemed to fit in real well. They liked him, he liked them. And he was then he got his license, and they became mate on the Island Queen. In September 1947, he was standing gate watch on that boat. The captain and the chief engineer came up, a fellow named Chief Dicko, and they were talking, and by that time, Captain Hall, who was the skipper of the boat, was going uptown. The boat was tied up in Pittsburgh, and there were no passengers on board. The boat wasn't going to have an excursion until that evening, and they were tied up foot of Wood Street there on Monongahela River. And Captain Hall, he was going to go uptown a while, and he kind of rounded to there at the gangway, and put his hand on the stanchion post on the fence there, on the handrail, and it was loose. And he says, he said to Chief Dicko, he says, "Hey, Freddie, how about welding this up before we board tonight?" And he said he would. So he went off and got his welding gear, and Wagner was just about ready to go off watch. That was almost noon. And Freddie Dicko, the engineer, said, "Ernie, why don't you stay out here with me while I weld this up?" And he said, "No, I got to get some sleep. I got to be a watchman on the dance floor tonight." So Captain Wagner, he was not captain yet, but mate Wagner went on up to his room and stripped down his skivvy drawers and his t-shirt, his undershirt, and climbed into bed. It was payday. It was Friday, and they got paid in cash. So he had his pay in cash and put it on a wallet on his nightstand. Fell asleep. No sooner did he fall into deep sleep, and the whole boat rocked. And what had happened, as soon as Chief Dicko had struck, it wasn't an arc, it was a gas welder, had put the welding torch down to weld that spot. The flame burned through the deck, and into just beneath the deck plates was a fuel bunker. It was heated 140 degrees, and when that flame hit that hot gas above there, the whole boat blew up, blew the oil up in the air, and all fell on the boat. Wagner, of course, jumped up, and there was smoke and fire was everywhere, and he went through he knew he had to get out of his room because everything was burning. As he went out into the hall, he realized his money was still on the night table, and he turned around to go back. And when he did, he tripped over it, and he couldn't see because of all the smoke. A person lying on the deck, lying on a fetal position, and a member of the band, and he picked the fellow up and carried him out to the side. By that time, the whole boat was totally engulfed in flames, and they were getting burned. And Wagner jumped over the side, and they were both fished out, and he saved the man's life. He told me about that, and I have that story in the book. But later on, well, his boat was gone, and later on he went during the Second World War. He that was 1947, but earlier than that, he had been in the Army, and he was kind of a decorated hero of Battle of Peleliu. But anyway, after the Island Queen burned, he then went to the Avalon, and they needed a captain. He had his master's license by then. He became captain of the steamer Avalon. At one time, they were playing, which we call in Charleston, West Virginia, and the Calliope had been played, and a passenger came up to him and he said, "Captain, how come you're not playing that Calliope? We want to hear that Calliope play." So I don't have a Calliope player; they're pretty hard to find. He said, "Well, the piano player do," and he said, "Well, not usually, because the Caliope's they had to hold the notes down, and usually an organ player it works better." And the fellow says, "Well, we got a young boy that lives here in town, young fellow that lives here in town. He's organ player for our church up here." And he says, "Maybe I could get up there and can I bring him down and let him try?" He said, "Well, sure, you could try." So fellow went up and brought down this young man named Clark Campbell Hawley, and brought his mom and dad with him. And Capt Wagner turned the steam on to the Calliope, and this young fellow took right to it, played it well. So he hired him, and just while the boat was there in Charleston, West Virginia, they paid him a little bit to play before the. I don't think he stayed on the boat at all. He'd just come down and before the rides, and he would play the Calliope. And of course, everybody loved it, and it probably increased the revenue. And so when the boat was getting ready to leave Charleston, Capt Wagner talked to young Clark's parents and said, would be okay if it was summertime, it was out of school, would be okay if he took the young man on the boat with him and for the summer, and he'd have his own room, and I'd look after him like he's my own son. And he did. Well, this young fellow really took this steamboat, and he wanted he had his other job that first year was popcorn popper. Popped the popcorn, make sure he had plenty of salt on it. It's one thing up in concession stands, we were told we had to put plenty of salt on the popcorn and plenty of ice in the drinks. And so he spent that summer working on the boat, and at one time or another, he wanted as I believe he's still in high school, and then when he was in college, worked summer on the boats, and I think he was pre-med major. Clark was, and that's how he picked up his nickname Doc. So everybody knows him as Doc Hawley, Clark Doc Hawley, and Doc got his mate's license. And my first acquaintance with this young Doc Hawley was when he was mate on the Avalon, and my father always got parking for the Avalon when it came to our hometown. So each year we received a thick book of passes, and we could ride the boat as much as we wanted for free. And I met Doc when he was his duty station when the boat was underway was up on the Texas deck outside among the passengers, where he supervised the kind of the watchman and sort of make sure some people get pretty rambunctious on those trips. Doc was a small guy, real small, fairly small, but he could if he wasn't the toughest guy on the boat, and that's what a good mate did. If he wasn't the toughest guy on the boat, then he had to make everybody believe he was, and I think Doc was real good at that. And we talked all during the trip and became real good friends after that. And I started work on the steamer Avalon in 1959 when I got out of high school. But that year, Doc was over on the Delta Queen, running as mate on the Delta Queen, because the Delta Queen uh, had unlimited tonnage for the licenses. The Avalon was a 1,400-ton license to operate as an officer, and so if you went on the Delta Queen, you got he was getting ready to get his master's license. So he spent that summer or year, 1959, over to Green Line on the Delta Queen to get unlimited tonnage. And then when I started back on the Avalon the next year, 1960, after uh, season in college, Doc was a mate, and he was a he was a tough mate. A lot of people, he was all, he was a great guy, but a lot of people don't realize that when he was mate on the steamboat, especially in his early years, he was a rough guy to work for. And I think Doc tried to run me off. He heard my footsteps. I was not too far behind him, say, and I had the same ambitions he did, was run the boat. And but all he did in those early, he'd give me the roughest, dirtiest, toughest jobs on the boat. I don't care what it was. And I'd always do them with, as one person used to say, with relish. One of the jobs he gave me was to get down underneath the port engine. All the grease and the oil that dripped off those engines all drained down into the hull. And back in those days, what we would do, they would pump. Of course, they get the water and condensation on top of it, and that stuff would be pumped overboard at night. But there was a rose box with a steam siphon would come down into as a box around it to try to shield other things from going up into the steam line. And that would get clogged up with grease and oil, and it would get thick. And of course, that was one job that everybody hated. But Doc made sure that I got that job. But I went, had a big pair of knee boots and weighed down and all that mess and all. Anyway, I got down. I always tried to do the best job I could. For some reason, I always kind of took to those kind of jobs. And the hatch to that was right underneath it. They had a little jail on there, it looked like a gorilla cage. And I was down inside there, and somebody come running back while I was down in there and says, Captain Hawley said, get up out of there and come on and help us get these groceries in. So I expected to go back down in that bilge after the groceries came on. So I had to climb out there, take those boots off, put my shoes on, go out and help bring on the groceries. And there were a lot more of them than I expected. While I didn't go back down there, and we had to, then immediately, right, and it lasted a long time. Then we had to start getting ready to board passengers for the moonlight ride. And I forgot to put the hatch cover back on. Well, I remember when he came on, this kind of little tough looking guy, and he had cigarettes rolled up under one arm and under one sleeve, and he had his own bottle of whiskey. Of course, you had to bring your own whiskey. And then he went long before he got drunk up on the dance floor, and he was fighting two of our watchmen and a couple more, and they were dragging him down. They were dragging this fella down to the jail, put him in the jail, keep him there until the boat got ashore. And they either turn him loose or turn him over to local authorities. Captain Hawley was with him, and he was helping pull this guy down. And one of the watchmen had blood right all down his shirt, where somebody punched him in the nose and whatever. Anyway, they get the jail's right behind the engine room. It must have been 130 degrees back there, and dark, semi-dark, not very much light back there. And they get this guy, and somebody opens the door of the jail, and two of these guys, they just throw this guy in the jail. And they did, and this man just hung, and I just hung there in space just for a moment, just hung there, and all of a sudden, boom, he just disappears down inside the building. And everybody's standing there with the jaws down on their chins down on their jaws, jaw down on their shirt, and what in the world had happened. And a few moments later, this guy climbs up out of there, and you just all you can see is eyeballs and teeth because he's covered in grease and oil. But I didn't work the last year on the boat. My parents were always trying to get me off the river, and so I missed one of the greatest years, the last season on the steamer Avalon. And then when the Delta Queen then docked, and Capt Wagner went over to the Delta Queen 1962, 59, 62, and I couldn't go. And why? It's because the boat was racially segregated in those days, and all the deckhands were African American. It was all segregated. But 65, when I graduated from college, I went over, and Capt Wagner found a space for me as fill-in watchman, and then I was able to get in the engine room with striker. And I went 4 years in the military and got out. And when I went out, I came back to Delta Queen, and Captain Hawley was the first mate, and Captain Wagner was still captain. But I was made second mate. Unlike I was second mate, learned apprentice to become mate. And April of 70, Captain Hawley went over to the Bella Louisville and became alternate master over there with Charlie. His name. And Captain Wagner put me on the back watch, and I took Doc Hawley's place as unlicensed mate, and until I got my license in June. And Doc stayed there several years until around 1976 or so, 75, 76, when the Natchez came out. He went down to steamer Natchez and spent the rest of his career at steamer Natchez in New Orleans. And we were the greatest of friends. I loved the man. He and I would talk at least once a month. If I didn't call him, he called me. But we also shared a very professional relationship. You know, it wasn't all hanging out and having drinks at certain bar or eating up a fancy restaurant up in New Orleans or something. We also had that relationship of a boss to employee, a mentor to kind of disciple thing. And I learned a lot from him. And I ran my boats a lot, but both of them, Captain Wagner and Captain Hawley. I did, through my career on the passenger boats, I did a lot. I did what they taught me. And they were both passenger boat oriented, and we knew a good clean, that's one of my specialties, was keeping a spotless clean boat. And I know that's a big thing on a lot of boats. Towboats are that way, keeping a spotless clean boat. And with a passenger trade, it really helps a lot because people feel safer when they come on a boat well maintained. They feel safer. But they were great guys and legends. But I know Captain Wagner's in the Hall of Fame. And Doc's, I don't know if he's been completely put into the fame. He has some recognition, and he will be. He will be. And 100 years from now, when people talk about steamboating and this period of time, they'll be talking about Ernie Wagner and Doc Hawley.
And maybe in 100 years' time, your name will be alongside them on that wall.
Well, maybe. Maybe. I hope that I do. But you know, the association of having been mentors to these two great men, it really is amazing.
Thank you very much again for your time, sir.
Well, it was great talking to you again. I hope I got something out of it.
I think we did. I'll talk to you soon.